Over the last 2 days, we have started a conversation that we hope will enliven discussion and debate around campus. From Senator Alexander to Governor Huntsman to General Clark, we have asked these world leaders to step forward and frame what they think are our nation's biggest priorities abroad.
Tonight, we look to culminate the discussion by setting our diplomatic sights on Latin America. As the former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox is credited with catalyzing Mexico's democratization. President Fox has succeeded in pursuing social and economic reforms, and it is credited with having an extensive knowledge of business practices in the developing world.
President Fox will be joined by Governor Bill Richardson, who will lend his own expertise to the discussion. Since leaving the public sphere as governor of New Mexico and President Clinton's Secretary of Energy, Governor Richardson was named chairman of APCO Worldwide's Executive Advisory Service and envoy of the Organization for American States.
Finally, we will have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Catherine Donato as moderator this evening. Professor Donato is the chairwoman of the Sociology Department and a migration specialist with extensive knowledge of Mexican policy. She currently serves on the advisory board of the Mexican Migration Project, and we are fortunate to have her with us tonight.
On behalf of the entire Vanderbilt University Speakers Committee, we would like to thank Dr. Donato, the Center for Latin American Studies, and the Dean of the university's library system, Connie Dowell, and all of her staff for helping us make this evening such a success. Whether this is your third night or your first, we would like to thank all of you for joining us and hope that you have enjoyed the 49th Annual IMPACT Symposium. Please join us in welcoming Governor Richardson, Dr. Donato, and President Fox to the stage.
President, thank you.
Checa, ¿qué pasó con Florence? Parece que ya resolvieron. A ver qué resolvieron.
Good evening. We're going to open the evening with a couple of minutes of comments from each of our distinguished speakers. So we will start now with Presidente Fox.
Sí. Muchísimas gracias. Buenas noches. I think that we're going to get into highly interesting issues during this conversation. So I elected for this provocation or introduction to speak a little bit about our two nations, Mexico and United States, and the long friendship that we have, the neighborhood that we share in that one border that might be one of the busiest borders worldwide. Over 1 million people cross that border every day, back and forth. And we also are partners. We have a trade balance of $500 billion US dollars, still the largest trade balance worldwide, out of which we import $250 billion from this nation and its products and services, and we export another $250 billion. This means that we're partners, and this means that by working together, we can protect our jobs, we can create new jobs, we can create wealth, and together with Canada, that we can keep being the largest market, consumer market in the world, the largest economic power in the world, and the largest bloc of nations working together. And I think if we want to look at the future, this North America of us, with its solid values and principles, the so-called values and principles of the founding fathers of this nation, and which is the dream of America, but I would say is the dream of all of the Americas, a dream that we share in this continent. And through our own will, capacities, resources, wisdom, we can keep being the leading bloc in the world. We can keep those principles and values alive for the 21st century and many more centuries else. Because the alternative, the question is, if this shift goes on from the west to the east, the question is, what are going to be the prevailing values that will be guiding the path of humanity during this next centuries? And the answer to that question is in our hands.
Thank you. Governor Richardson.
Thank you. I want to thank Vanderbilt and the student body for hosting this forum, for inviting me. I'm very pleased on many fronts. One being on the same stage with President Fox, who I believe has done more to bring democracy to Mexico. You're supposed to give him a nice hand. Thirdly, I'm very happy we're going to talk about Latin America. You know, I do a lot of speeches around the country. It's always the Middle East, Afghanistan, energy, but today it's Mexico and Latin America. And I want to commend Vanderbilt for focusing on our region, because I believe our region is neglected by Republican and Democratic administrations, by the Congress, by the executive branch. So the issues that really are important that Catherine is going to moderate on, immigration, the fact that we don't have an immigration bill, the fact that this is a problem nobody wants to touch. Secondly, the issues of trade and commerce. Third, the issues of Cuba and the drug trade, a role where I believe Mexico needs to play a broader foreign policy role. I'm very pleased also, as the only Hispanic governor for many years of Mexican descent, that we are talking about the Hispanic community in the United States and its impact on migration and trade and many other issues. So I want to just close with the hope that this series that you have started, the third day, focus again and continues to focus on issues that affect you here in Tennessee and at Vanderbilt. You're an international university, the Harvard of the South, although you probably, I don't know if you like that title. But I've been very impressed with the contact I've had with the students, with the professors, the thirst of knowledge, and I know we're going to get into some very, very interesting and very important issues.
Okay, in my hand, I have several questions, and we will, I will ask, the format for the next 45 minutes or so will be that I will ask these broad questions and ask both of our speakers to comment, and perhaps I'll prod them for a little more detail or some clarification, and then we'll move on to the next question. So I thought I would start by bringing up what we know in the United States to be obvious. In the last 10 years, we've been fighting 2 wars. And then in the last year or so, the last 12 months or so, we have been watching a fair amount of political instability, volatility in a number of Middle Eastern countries, Europe, Egypt, and then currently Syria. And you know, that part of the world has always been important to this part of the world because of its energy resources and reserves. And so I guess going forward into the 21st century, given what I know about Latin America and Mexico, in fact, there's a fair amount of energy reserves there too. So I'd like for both of you to comment on what you think the role of energy could be or will be in the future of U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America. Mr. President?
Thank you. It's a key strategic role to the future energy, especially to our economies. The bad news is that Mexico, being gifted by God with one of the largest reserves on oil, we're just 9 years away on not having one more barrel of oil to export. And this is because we keep the energy sector as a monopoly, a total monopoly in hands of the state. No other nation, nor Cuba, nor Russia, nor China, no other nation or economy keep this old paradigm of a state-run economy, at least in some of the sectors. And this is the case in Mexico. The good news is the comparison with Brazil. No more than 6-7 years ago, Brazilian economy was smaller than Mexican economy by 25%. Today, Brazilian economy almost doubles the size of Mexican economy. And one of the big strategic changes that Brazil did is opening up its oil industry and energy sector to private investment, associating private with public investment. So they came to the market with 30% of the stock of Petrobras. And just by doing that, the incredible change happened. We in Mexico still are reluctant to take that step. I hope that next government in Mexico will have better luck than what we had in the case of President Cedillo, in the case of President Fox, the case of President Calderon. The three of us have proposed Congress to take a step similar to the one that Brazil took. And we, all three of us, for 18 years have been blocked. So I think it's absolutely mandatory that for next administration, the change will occur. So that's the importance of the energy sector in Mexico and in Latin America.
Governor?
You know, as I came in today from New Mexico, the limousine driver that picked me up, by the way, it's not a big car, but complained about $4 a gallon gas prices. He says, regular. He said, this is absurd. And after we got into a little political argument because he was starting to blame the president for that. And I was saying to him, no, you know, this worldwide demand, what happens in China and India, more demand, volatility in the world. I mean, we've had an extraordinary year, the last 2 years on energy, Fukushima, which showed the vulnerabilities, I think, of nuclear power, oil prices, Iran threatening in the Straits of Hormuz, the price of oil going way up. Natural gas is sort of the savior, the bridge fuel that is emerging. So what do? We still have OPEC, which is the 10, 12 countries that basically set the world price. They're a monopoly. What they say, when they increase production, the price maybe goes down. They lower production levels, the price is up. It's, I don't know what it is, 110, 108 today. So what should we do as it relates to Latin America? Number one, Mexico and Canada are allies. So we need to get more of our fossil fuels. And I'm an advocate of shifting away from fossil to solar, wind, to geothermal, to clean fuels, to alternative fuels, natural gas, transportation fuels. But still, the reality is that what you want to do, if you're going to get fossil fuels, get it from your friends. Now, the good news is that imported oil coming into the U.S. has declined. That's good. And oil from Canada and Mexico has increased. But I think one of the things we need to do is strengthen our energy ties with Latin America and especially with Mexico. So what should we do? Right now, our two governments are talking about joint drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, safe, environmentally safe drilling, which right now, I believe, is pending before our Congresses. We should ratify that. I think the President mentioned it makes sense for Mexico to privatize, to find ways to let competition go into their oil sector, but there are enormous political challenges. I think the good news that I've seen, and the President may disagree, is that the candidate for the PRI, which is probably going to win, is also for privatizing some of this, and I think that's a good sign. Renewable energy, I think with Mexico we have great opportunities, not just on the border. When I was governor, we did with the Mexican state some joint solar and wind projects, some real concrete possibilities of getting financing from the World Bank, the Inter-American Bank, to do some renewable energy projects. But just strategically for us, it makes sense to buy oil from our friends so we're not vulnerable from OPEC, from the Saudis, from the Nigerians, from other countries that play off the world price. And what you're seeing right now is an international community that is mainly consumer countries, Europe, Japan, vulnerable totally to this fossil fuel monopoly of OPEC. But also, I think, as individuals, as Americans, we have to make this shift to renewable, to energy efficiency, to fuel efficiency. I assume this is a fuel-efficient building, although it's pretty hot here. I think that is very good. And I think Vanderbilt, I know that you guys have a good record on leads in many other areas.
Okay, we are going to shift gears a little bit, although we're going to talk a bit about the economy. The economies of Latin America are, most economists would describe as being fairly robust now. Whereas for most of the 20th century, or for a large part of the 20th century, the U.S. economy, especially in the last couple of decades in the 20th century, the U.S. economy was the robust economy. I think that, there's also some, related to the economy, there are issues of free trade, which Mexico, the United States, and Canada are part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. But nonetheless, I think it would be interesting for us to hear your commentary about what the future might look like if Latin America, Mexico and all of Latin America, actually its economy is stronger, more robust for a sustained period of time. What sort of consequences will that have on U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America?
Well, I have had a very personal point of view of what happened with the global economy and each of our nation's economies when we hit the crisis of 2008. And those who, on my thinking, were brilliant minds that had the wisdom to nourish, to fuel with financing the economy through either the mortgages or through multiplying $1 of credit up to $20 worth. Maybe we overdid it by stopping totally that was being done, which brought to the world and to humanity the best 10 years that we ever have had. All the economies in the world increased their pace of growth. Poverty was reduced considerably most everywhere in the world. Middle classes grew like they never had done before. So we were on a very virtuous cycle. Latin America alone, in those 10 years, we were able to reduce poverty by 18%. And in the case of Mexico, by 33%. So companies, corporations, governments, economies, investors, everybody had access to financing to fuel the economy. I really think we overdid it. We cut everything back, and now the problem is how can you keep your economies running? How can you keep consumption increasing? How can you work out to have more and more middle classes with the capacity to consume, and so that investment can be incentivized? So to me, somebody has to come in with great, innovative, creative ideas to move back economies throughout the world. Today, the machines that are moving the world are not the large economies like the European countries or United States. It's the emerging nations. It's the rise of emerging nations like real machines pulling development ahead. And I hope we can keep seeing China growing at rates of 10%, India growing at 8%, all of Latin America together at rates of 6%, like we're doing now, so that those engines can keep economies running. At the very end, I'm absolutely convinced that institutions are important and indispensable, but nothing substitutes the leadership, the individual entrepreneurship, and those who have the vision to see the future and to nourish and fuel the growth of that future. And those leaders might be sitting here in this great university, state-of-the-art university, Vanderbilt, or might be sitting somewhere else studying. But at the very end, yes, we need the Bill Gates, we need the Google founders, we need those brilliant minds that can have the capacity to come with ideas that will keep the world moving ahead. In the meantime, this charter is in the shoulders of economies like Brazil, like Mexico, like Russia, like China, like India, like the 7 tigers in Asia. And hopefully, through their growth, the large, mature economies like United States and Europe will come back to growth. But for that, there is 2 things that are absolutely needed. One is to reduce deficits. The case of Europe is incredible, and this nation also has huge deficits. And number 2, to reduce debt, because otherwise the capacity to grow is not going to be there.
Governor?
Well, you know, you go to conferences, and these are the sexy countries of the world. And I think President Fox touched on them. And by the way, I think he did a great job in Mexico on reducing what I think is the biggest problem, that's income inequality. And that's the biggest problem worldwide in Latin America. But Brazil, India, China, South Korea. And I always think of myself and I say, well, what about Mexico? Mexico is growing. But if you look strategically at regions in the world, Europe has had enormous problems. The United States is having enormous problems. The Far East, except perhaps for China, although there's been some slowdown. Latin America, in terms of economic growth, in terms of employment, has been the region with the strongest economic indicators. And instead of us paying more attention in the areas of trade and commerce and free trade agreements, we have several with Latin America, we kind of still look at Europe and the EU and China, and we don't look at our own neighbors to the south, which I think is a big strategic mistake. Now, obviously, the Mexican economy is very tied to the American economy, so when we have enormous problems, they have problems, and it's not entirely their fault. But I think what needs to happen in terms of the world economy is to recognize that there are regions that deserve more economic connections, and there are regions that deserve more help, like Africa. When you look at pandemic diseases and when you look at income inequality and the fact that 1 out of 2 Africans lives under the poverty level, the same statistics in the indigenous people in Latin America and many other areas. But I think the world economy is still neglecting the deficit issue, the debt issue, stimulus, the poorest of the poor, the inequality of human beings not having enough to feed their families. And I think that is something that is going to need new approaches, giving people individual skills of entrepreneurship, having the World Bank and some of the international financial institutions and a lot of the banks of the world focus on giving women, for instance, entrepreneurial skills like the Grameen Bank, new agricultural methods, new renewable energy, I think, is a job creator. Finding ways, for instance, in our border, Central America, of giving young men that come into the United States to become gang members because there's no opportunity in their country. Give them skills, job-building skills that I think deserve new approaches. So I agree the world economy needs to focus, get itself together on the debt issue, on the deficit issue, on stimulus, but still the income inequality of human beings, especially in our own region, is something we should focus on, but also on the growth and trade issues. This is a region of the world that is growing and that the economies are basically stable. And I think Mexico is one that is going to continue to be moving in that very stable direction.
Okay, I'm going to switch sides now and begin by asking the governor the next question, or two, so that everyone gets their fair shake here. Unfortunately, from my perspective, one of the things, most of what people know in the United States about Mexico has to do currently with the drug wars, the drug cartels and the movement of those cartels by the recent administration, President Calderon. And of course, back 10 years ago, what we knew about Colombia was the same thing. And that's what the news covers. And yet, I wonder, given the expertise and the human capital on both of my sides here, I wonder to what extent the current situation and the past situation with Colombia has consequences for U.S. foreign policy toward these countries and toward the region overall. So if you could speak perhaps to that issue, Governor, first?
Well, I've dealt with this issue when I was UN ambassador. I've dealt with it as a governor, the drug trade. And I'm going to make an admission here that may startle you. I don't have an answer on this issue. And neither option, which I will describe, I believe is working. But maybe there will be thinkers and cooler heads, and maybe the president has some thoughts. The drug war has been a failure. It's not worked. Presidents, Republican, Democrat, Mexican presidents have tried, and we have right now what is called a Plan Mérida, where we're cooperating, the two countries, several $1 billion of military assistance, training, intelligence between the two countries to try to curtail this cartels. And coca plantations in Latin America and Colombia. Colombia's made some good strides, and I think there's been positive strides in Mexico, but it really hasn't worked. So we put more money in drug enforcement and law enforcement, and I think the answers in the United States are obvious. And Secretary Clinton, I think, made a frank admission that one of the problems is the increased demand in the United States. There's a lot of demand for cocaine and marijuana, and we should admit it. So we have a responsibility. So what should we do besides the Plan Meritus? I think what we need to do in this country, and we're not doing it, is spend more on rehabilitation, on drug education. We need to spend more resources on training. We need to find alternative methods of treatment. I don't know the answers. I'm not a doctor. We tried a little in New Mexico, but the problem just kept cascading. And so what a lot of responsible leaders are saying around Latin America, many of them ex-presidents, because they never said this as presidents, is let's decriminalize. Decriminalize. Then the demand is reduced. And I don't think that'll work either, but I don't know. It's never been tried. California may be moving that way. I know in my state it wouldn't work because law enforcement is so against it. But maybe there's, maybe we ought to find ways to have some areas on the border as test pilots. I don't know. So what I'm saying to you is that I think this is one of these policy problems where for now there is no solution. Maybe there is. And maybe our scientists and our bright new policymakers emerging like you guys can think of ways to make the situation better. But, Professor, I am saying, Catherine, that, I can spout out, rah, we're going to do this and that and increase assistance. And, the president knows in Mexico this is a huge problem that has consumed this government of President Calderon. Like this is almost all they do. Focus on the drug trade, on the cartels. And, when President Fox was there, he was a leader on Cuba, on Latin America, and Mexico now, its foreign policy is almost focused intensively on just the cartel issue. And I don't think that's good for Mexico. I think it's not good for the hemisphere. But I am admitting to you I have no solution on this problem. So what's yours?
Well, we'll get to that with the questions, perhaps. President Fox.
This thing is killing us in Mexico. We have to get out of this trap. We don't deserve to be where we are. We just happen to be in between those who produce the drug on the south, the Colombia, which keeps producing the same levels that they used to produce before, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and the huge market on the north, which is this nation. A market that is worth $50 billion US, sustained by either heavy consumers or totally addicted consumers or light consumers in the number of 60 million people that one way or another consume drugs in this nation. In this nation, consuming drugs is penalized. It's a crime. So 60 million criminals are out there on the streets consuming drugs, committing a crime. In the case of Mexico, consumption is not penalized. And most in all nations outside the United States, it's not penalized, consuming. It's penalized distributing or selling or producing. So it's very difficult to explain to ourselves what happens with one cargo load of drugs once it crosses the border? Who takes that drug to Seattle, to Chicago, to Washington, D.C., to San Francisco, to all over the United States? Who takes it there? Who distributes? Who sells? Who collects? Who launders the money? Who brings it back to Mexico or to Colombia or to Ecuador to pay for the drug? So these are questions that we must address. And number two, the case of Mexico is unique because we have a president that has said very courageously and very firm, that's it, no more drugs. So he brings in the army, he brings all police corps and all resources that the state has to attack the supply side. And let me tell you, in Mexico, we are not heavy drug consumers. Per capita consumption in Mexico compared to the United States would be 1%. And we're not producers of drugs in Mexico. We don't produce heroin, we don't produce cocaine, we produce marijuana. And there are some figures that show that just the state of California is producing more marijuana than what is produced in Mexico. So here we are in between in this trap, paying a cost that we don't deserve and that nobody else has. How do we get out of this trap? Yes, at least me personally, I have been studying and evaluating. What about depenalizing? Public opinion in the world is moving towards that very fast. I participated on a Google World program with an audience of 800 million people, and there were about 50 of us participating on the analysis. And most everybody now is moving towards depenalizing, decriminalizing, and even legalizing. And you hear voices like President Cardoso, like President Cedillo, like President Lagos from Chile, like many world leaders, many intellectuals, many academics, the United Nations, and most everywhere. Now you hear voices stating very clearly, this has not worked. The war on drugs is a total failure. Consumption keeps increasing. As a consequence, production and the black market and the money that nourishes and finances the criminals keeps growing. So we must have a new approach in trying to solve this. Presidente Calderón says, okay, that's it, no more drugs. It's a dream. Drugs are going to be there forever. But I have not heard that position from the President of the United States or the drug agencies in the United States or the security agencies in the United States. Nobody has said here, okay, stop it. No more drugs for our kids in the United States. You have not brought in the Army or the National Guard or everybody on this purpose. So I'm inclined for advancing towards legalization. The founding fathers of this nation also stated, is it the right of governments and the state to intervene on moral behaviors or ethical behaviors of the individuals? Shouldn't we respect that freedom of decision? Have not we abolished most of the prohibitions that existed in this world? Starting with the alcohol prohibition 100 years ago in Chicago, and that was the solution to end up with violence. prohibition of sex, prohibition of abortion, prohibition of marriage between persons of the same sex now has been abolished, and it's in most of our constitutions in many nations. It is now permitted. At the very end, prohibitions don't work, or imposed prohibitions don't work. Only work those who we do within ourselves and the limits we impose to ourselves. Even in Garden of Eden, the prohibition of the apple was not respected.
Let me ask both of you to speak a little bit more on this issue with respect to one point. As a professor here, I teach a course on contemporary Mexican society. And the issue of a wall between Mexico and the United States comes up quite often. But what's more interesting to me recently is that often students, and then of course people that I talk to, as I say what I teach in this university and I speak to outside the university, say, well, those drug wars, okay, should lead to US policy to build a wall between the two countries. So before we get to our last question, which is about migration, I wonder if you could comment on whether, not only whether or not you approve the wall, you think the wall is, because I think that's the easy answer, whether or not, but what is behind this idea? How is it possible that the disruption of the drug cartels in Mexico in the last almost 6 years now, right, has led to this belief that we should further separate ourselves with a geographic marker that if it gets built, it would be very hard to take down? President Fong?
I really think we went the easy route on building that wall. And the reason to build it is fear. You build walls when you have fear. And fear is not a good advisor. And very unfortunately, after September the 11th, at least for myself, I feel a sentiment of fear in this nation, that it might be attacked again. And it was maybe the worst of the dates to remember September the 11th. It was terrible that day. But I still that we human beings have better ways of bringing solutions to problems than building walls. And same as prohibitions, walls don't work either. Chinese wall didn't work against their enemies. Berlin Wall didn't work against freedom. And this wall is not going to bring the solution that we need. At the very end, it's related to fear of terrorism, but also migration. And yes, we need to put together regulation, laws to administrate the migration phenomena. Because migration is a clearly positive issue. And our nations, this nation, Mexico and Latin America at the very end, have been built by migrants. Nobody in this room can deny the fact that all of us have a migrant heritage behind. That our families way back or closer back came from somewhere else to build this great nation. Starting with my grandfather, who came from Strasburg to Cincinnati, Ohio, with his family. And his great-grandfather came to this great nation. But then my grandfather decided to migrate down to Mexico. And that's where he found his American dream. He went there without a penny in his pocket. So migration can be a win-win situation if we administrate, if we regulate, if we come with a proper framework that we need. And by the way, that framework, that bill is sitting in U.S. Congress now for over 6 years, or close to 7. That bill presented by Senator Kennedy and Senator McCain, a bipartisan bill. I think the answer, the wisdom, the talented answer is sitting right there in Congress. And President Bush administration and mine, we dedicated long nights and days working on preparing that bill. We had the honor and the fortune to receive President Bush back in your home in Rancho San Cristobal in Guanajuato, Mexico, on his first state visit. Even before going to Canada, he came to Mexico. And that's where we built the first presidential library ever outside of the United States. And that's where all of you have a home. And that's where President Bush came in and gave a great kiss to my mom. And my mom went crazy. And we discussed for a day and a half only one issue, migration. And we committed, both administrations, that we would go ahead with a total migration reform. And we worked intensely on it until September the 11th came. And priorities changed. And that one priority was forgotten. And I think that we still have time to make sure that we re-energize NAFTA, which today is dormant, and that we come up with an answer to migration. And this part of the world, this North America of us, will be the leading bloc, the leading region of the world for many decades and many centuries to come. And we just have to have that kind of vision and that kind of wisdom. That's why I put together these issues, because they are mixed together. At the very end, maybe many of you don't know that the imports that Mexico makes from this nation, those $250 billion US dollars a year, mean hundreds of thousands, millions of jobs to US citizens in this nation. So we're real partners. We just have to have the capacity to see that we can do much more by working together than by building walls. We should build bridges of understanding, of friendship, of partnership, and we'll do much better to the future.
Governor?
The responsibility of every American public official, whether you're Congress, governor, county commissioner, is to enforce our laws. And this is what I'm for when it comes to the border. And I had to deal with this almost every day as one of the 4 border governors. I do believe that we need enhanced border security, boots on the ground, technology to enforce our laws, to keep cartels from coming in. And I'm very much for that, and I think that is something that should continue to happen. Now, do you build a wall? No, that's absurd. You build a 10-foot wall, you're going to have 12-foot ladders everywhere. And by the way, that was my line several years ago, although it's been adopted by... and by the way, there are a lot of people that don't agree with us, that if you agree with the president and I on this, all you have to do is watch some of the primary debates, and where there are very strong voices for these walls. The wall is impractical. It technologically can't be built. They tried it in a part of California. It was inefficient. Now, so what do we do? This is a problem that Mexico and the U.S. have to do together. But Mexico has to do its part. And I've always kind of been a strong advocate for immigration reform, a legalization of the 12 million people that are here. Don't give them automatic citizenship, but if they speak English, they pay back taxes, they pass a criminal check, they embrace American values, let them stay. That's the Kennedy-McCain effort. Let them, for a period of time, get a green card and work and keep their families reunified. I'm all for that. I think there has to be penalties on those that hire illegally. And that's your comprehensive immigration bill. Increase border security, legalization, recognize what's the alternative. You're going to deport 12 million people? How are you going to do that? But there's some that want to do it that are out there. So comprehensive immigration reform is an issue where if you're a politician, you're going to lose votes on that. I never found the immigration issue to get you any votes with anybody. So nobody wants to touch it. Both sides don't want to touch it. President Bush tried to get it done. I'll give him credit, but his own party revolted. President Obama's tried to do it, and both parties don't want to get it done in the Congress. But maybe there'll be a chance that after the election, they'll take another look at it. I hope so. Now, in New Mexico, I did it a little differently. My state is 47% Hispanic. I was reelected twice, and I did a couple of things that right now, if I were like one of the Republican candidates, they'd kill me off the stage. But what I did was, with the help of the legislature, I passed a DREAM Act. They're talking about a DREAM Act, which I did it. We did it 8 years ago. It wasn't recent. You got to fulfill the same standards as any other student and get the same scholarship benefits, but you've got to just qualify to make that happen. The second thing I did, which, by the way, there are a lot of budding politicians here. I don't recommend you make this the center of your campaign, but New Mexico was one of the 3 states, it's now 2, that allowed driver's licenses to illegal workers. Well, you're the only support that is out there for that. But we did that not because, we're trying to just be charitable, because it works. Here's how it works. Here's how it worked in our state. By doing those licenses, we lowered the number of traffic fatalities. Number 2, all of these people that got licenses got insurance, so they got insured. And third, if you want to be, evil, that's a way to keep track of them. They sign their names, and you know where they are. And our idea was to integrate them into society and make them feel that they, as the president said, they're working, they're creating jobs. So we had this different approach. But this is an issue, and Catherine is a migration expert, that really could divide this country, that I hope that all of you here after this election, regardless of what happens, that this be a national push, along with an energy policy and deficits. I know there are a lot of priorities, but this is something that's underground and boiling, and it's out there, and I think we have to fix it.
Good. Give me one comment here.
A follow-up?
Let me tell you something I heard from Colin Powell at the Grove in San Francisco, California, a speech before large audience, over 2,000 people, where I shared with him in addressing these people there. I quote, he said, "In a way, this nation is blind because it's not clear and known that in no more than 20 years, minorities will be majorities." And he said, if they are going to lead this nation, we need to open the doors, at least of education, to them. And of course, the driving licenses. I think coming from him It's a very wise statement that we must find a way, and I'm not for open borders. We must find a way of how to attend this demand for education and this demand for equal opportunities and quality of life to those who would have and deserve the right to stay here to work. And so nobody's claiming to break the law. As Governor said, what we need is maybe to reshape, adapt the regulations and the law that today exist so that we can make out of this issue that win-win situation that I think is very feasible to do.
A very quick follow-up question, and then I think we'll open the floor up to a number of questions. One of the questions I get often from students and other people around the country and in Mexico when I give these talks is, why is there no leadership on the migration issue? Not only in the US, mind you, but why is there no leadership? Latin America, certainly Mexico, large numbers of Mexicans migrating to the US for probably 200 years if we were counting all the way back. And sent from Central America, from South America. Why do we have no leadership? Why is it, Governor, as you say, and as we all know, no politician wants to touch this in the US? If we understood why, maybe we could actually find the leader, if we could solve that problem. So I wonder, from the origin countries, what President Fox, about leadership on the issue of migration. South America has been sending very large numbers of people to Europe, and unauthorized, as well as many Mexicans coming to the US. And Governor, same thing. What is at the source of this problem?
Well, maybe to motivate leadership, the figures are that Mexican population is a young population. US population is an elderly adult population. And Mexico, in the last century, 3 times doubled the population. We went from 18 million to 36 million to 80 million to over 100 million. That will never happen again. By 2030, population growth in Mexico will level off. And this is the population pyramid, what it shows. So that's as far as we will go, about 130 million, and that's it. Then I guess both of our nations are going to be questioning ourselves, where do we get the energy, the youth, the working force to sustain our economies? Who is going to sustain the pension and retirement plans of people here in the United States? You need a working force, young and energetic, to keep the economy generating the funds needed for those pension plans and retirement plans. Who is going to nurse and keep care of the elderly in this nation? And by that time, Mexico will be absorbing all of its population, and it's not a optimistic thinking, because we come from growing 3.5% a year, our population. There is no economy that could respond to keep that amount of people in the schools and to have a job and a home for them. But now we're growing 1% a year. And pretty soon, as I said, we will level off. So to motivate the leadership and the thinking and the vision to the future, there are the figures. Not long from now, we'll have to shift the strategy on both of our nations.
All right, well, I got to admit something. When I said this, and I was in a similar panel with President Calderon, it wasn't quite a panel, but I asked the question. He got mad at me, so I hope President Fox doesn't get mad at me when I say this, because, look, you know, to resolve a problem, you need both countries. And what could Mexico do? I remember getting up and saying and Calderon was there, I said, well, you know, Mr. President, why don't you create some jobs in Mexico at the border so they don't come to the U.S.? You know, there was silence, and then he wasn't happy. My point is that I think there has to be some joint strategies. You know, look where the migration patterns. I think a lot of the Mexicans that come to the U.S., a lot of them are from central Mexico. They're not necessarily from the border. You know, find ways that either through NAFTA or through some joint jobs program, some joint efforts by the governments, entrepreneurship, private sector, that we can attack this problem together. And, you know, the reality is a lot of Mexican presidents, not Fox, because he was serious about this, say, well, you know, it's not our problem, let those workers go. And so that's a political reality that has to be faced. And I think it's a lot better. Now, you asked, Catherine, about U.S. politicians. This is a terrible issue for a politician. The undocumented workers can't vote for you, so people just get mad at you. And other entities get mad when you say put more border resources. But many times politicians should take the lead. But you know, here's a case where the people, we're ordinary citizens, we're individuals like you. I'm now a big fanatical supporter of Arab Springs, you know, through Facebook, through Twitter. You cause revolutions, you change the world. I think that's starting to happen in our country. And you're going to see more of that affecting political change. And hopefully the immigration issue, which is not just Mexicans, it's not just Hispanics, it's the Irish, it's trying to come in, the Brits trying to come in, legal immigration. Our immigration system entirely is broken. Red tape, you know, somebody, your family's from England wanting to come in, but they can't come in because the quotas have not been increased because of bureaucracy, not because of the law. So hopefully this is something after the election that the population will say, come on, politicians, resolve this problem. And then, you know, we get a little help in Mexico and maybe some joint job creation programs, and at least we've made a dent.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're ready now to open up the conversation to our audience. If there are two microphones on the right and left side. I think we have time to take about 4 questions, but we'll see how lengthy the questions are and the answers are. Okay, so I will move to my right first. Please identify yourself and tell us, you know, where you are at Vanderbilt, what your major is, something about yourself, and then state your question.
Gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate you giving us some of your time. My name is Aaron Villarreal. I graduated from Vanderbilt in 2010. And as someone who was raised in El Paso, Texas, right across the border from Juarez, Mexico, the issue of violence pertaining to the drug wars is one that affects me personally. My family and many of our friends have relatives and friends in Mexico that have actually been victims of this violence. And you spoke earlier about there always being drugs in Mexico, President Fox, and that's very discouraging to hear. My question is this: if Mexico is to continue growing at rates if their economy, it continues to grow at rates that are favorable and sustainable, it must project stability, and it's hard for economies to grow if there's not strong rule of law and if there's not stability in the country. And even in best case scenario, say their energy sector is privatized, and how is Mexico going to attract foreign investment and even domestic investment if this violence continues to occur? And if the next president of Mexico places the same priority on confronting the drug cartels that President Calderon has, what kind of realistic conclusions do you see resulting from, and how do you see, what realistic ways do you see this confrontation ending? This is for President Fox. Thank you.
Very quickly, we have to get out of this trap. You mentioned the cost, but there is a superior cost by not having peace and harmony, which is losing hope to the future, and which is losing faith in our nation. That could become an irreparable cost, so we must move ahead with something, some creative way to move out. I would just mention one example, and of course I was told to be crazy when I mentioned this, but some of you might remember Subcomandante Marcos in Chiapas. He came with a guerrilla, a rebellion, to destroy government, to separate Chiapas from the national territory, and they came out killing thousands of people in one day. The reaction of government was to create a commission composed by Congress, Senate, and congressmen, by the executive branch and the presidency, by the judiciary, by the church, and some other leaders. That commission was called COCOPA. And the instruction was, go there and look for a ceasefire, sit them on a table to have a dialogue, and let's try to get out of this trap where we are. Just 2 weeks later, they were sitting together on a dialogue. They tell me today, no, if you don't negotiate with criminals. You can negotiate with guerrillas and revealing people, but not with criminals. Well, I don't know what the difference would be in that case. And it worked, because 6 months later, they were talking about how to recuperate the rights to the indigenous people. So they had a good cause then, and now everybody worked towards that. But at the very end, what they got is a ceasefire, sitting down, negotiating on a dialogue. Cesar Gaviria, president of Colombia, when this issue of the extraditables was growing and growing, by sending criminals to meet U.S. justice, extradited to U.S. justice. Criminals really didn't like that, the cartels, so they complained about it. But what Gaviria came out to offer is the following, and I again quote. He said, I'm willing to finish with extradition to the United States as long as you submit yourselves to Colombian justice. And if you do that, your assets and your patrimony will be respected. That was the offer. And in a way, it softened the crisis. I don't think it's right to have the army on the streets on this war against criminals, where over 50,000 kids have been killed, 15 to 25-year-olds. They were not born criminals. They do not have criminality on their genes. Some way along the path, they lost the way. And I think that we must consider that loss, because it's not only them 50,000 that died, another 50,000 that killed them. And it's estimated another 100,000 kids that are working for the cartels for a salary of $1,000 a month. And why is this happening? Because of the lack of opportunities. That's why this principle of equal opportunities is so key and crucial. Because if those kids would have had a seat on a school or on a university, I'm sure they would not be there. If those kids would have a job where they would be paid $1,000 a month, they would not be there with the criminals. So I think they're rescuable, and we must find new strategies. So I would withdraw the Army. I would start moving on this direction of equal opportunities to everybody, and I would be sending maybe somebody from the church to start speaking to these guys and tell them, calm down, guys, please take it easy, and let's look for some way to solve this problem.
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Kyle Blaine. I am an editor at the student newspaper here, and my question is for the governor. If you pay attention to pundits, which I don't know if you do or not, there's a strong indication that a Hispanic could be the number 2 on a Republican presidential ticket in the fall. I just have a question. What do you think someone like Marco Rubio and his popularity means for Hispanic political identity in the United States?
Well, here's my view, and I'm now a private citizen, although I do have my proclivities. I think if Governor Romney, who I think right now will be the nominee, but I find it very difficult for him to be able to recover from this very bitter primary, puts Senator Rubio on the ticket, it will be an asset to him. It will be good for Romney. Now, why is it good for Romney? One, you mentioned the Hispanic population being key in this election. Traditionally, to win the presidency, Democrats have to get 65% of the Hispanic vote nationally, 65 to 35. The only time it didn't happen recently was when President Bush, George Bush, beat Gore, although, there's still a question about that one, got 40%. He got 40% of the vote, of the Hispanic vote. Now, that's all the Republicans need to get to make a dent and possibly get electoral victories in smaller states like New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, that are going to be key. If Rubio goes on the ticket, I think it's going to be tough for Democrats to win Florida, which is a hugely important state. But this is where the immigration issue, and Rubio is not good on the immigration issue. I've heard his position. If he moves to the center and he's picked, then it could get some votes for the Republicans. But if he stays with this very harsh position that almost every Republican candidate has adopted on anti-immigrant, anti-DREAM Act, and saying, well, Hispanics just care about jobs, so talk about jobs, it's not going to be good. But I think, I don't know Rubio. I was asking some students that I spoke to this morning that are Floridians that know him. The general impression is positive. What I've seen media-wise is positive, so I would say he's probably would be an asset and has a good chance of being picked.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
I wanted to thank you both first for coming and speaking to us. It's a real treat. More and more families are crossing into the United States, often illegally, in order to give birth to children who are then granted United States citizenship. This has caused debate in the United States of what we should do with these families with conflicting citizenship. Should we stop granting citizenship to children who are born in the United States, to all children who are born in the United States? Should we grant amnesty to parents of children with United States citizenship, or is there another solution?
Governor, you want
Should
to
I?
start?
Well, I'll start. Look, the Constitution says if you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen. And I think, that was sort of a nativist argument about a year ago that, got a lot of attention and that I don't think it's moved much. I think family reunification is critically important. We've got to keep families together, At the same time, we have to respect the law. This is why I said an immigration bill respects the law. You enforce our border security. You look at the individuals that are here. You give them some kind of status by having them pass some standards, learn English, pay back taxes, pay a fine for having come here illegally, embrace American values, take tests on American values, and pass a background check. And those that don't, leave. But then those that pass those standards get behind those that are trying to get here legally. There are individuals that are trying to get here legally that deserve, I think, first crack.
Very quickly on that one, just to say that that bill or initiative that is in Congress separates the two lines. One is a waiting line to become U.S. citizen. The other one is a waiting line for people that want to come here temporarily to work, make some money, and go back home. I would say most of the migrants are on this side because they like more tacos and mole than hot dogs and hamburgers. No, really. They would love to go back home, and they're only waiting to make some money and go back home. So I think that bill that is in Congress is very wise because it separates, it considers this issue of migrating to look for a better life, but not necessarily to become a U.S. citizen.
Okay, one final question. Let's see, yeah, probably one final question.
Hi, my name is Jessie Solomon. I'm a medical student, and I just wanted to ask about why you thought that there was fewer drug problems and addictions in Mexico compared to the United States, because the drug and addiction pathway is the strongest pathway, one of the strongest pathways in the brain, and it is a disease. It's not necessarily a choice. And so I was wondering if you could explain why it's less prominent in Mexico, and if either of you had any suggestions for the healthcare system in America to help this problem.
Well, I make the statement from facts. Those are the facts. The amount of drug consumed in Mexico is much less than in the United States. And there's a different rate of consumption in different nations. But there's no other that I know except maybe one or two European nations that per capita consumption is as high as it is in the United States. Might be because you have the capacity to buy the drugs, or might be just because of it's been gradually expanding for a longer period of time. I don't know the reasons, but the facts are that our consumption is way below the one here in the United States.
You know, I think the President answered your question, and one issue that we didn't get to was the decriminalizing issue. I came out basically saying I'm very wary of it, but I'm willing to listen to, and the President said we ought to start thinking about it. But I'd be willing, maybe, you know, if you got 2 more minutes, if somebody can show, because I say to people, okay, you're for decriminalizing. That's the easy answer because the other side isn't working. Show me data that decriminalization is going to work. All right, you're reducing the demand, but show me something. Is there anybody here that would advocate for decriminalizing and give the arguments for it that would make sense and persuade a former president and a former governor? Go ahead. No, stand up, stand up.
By the microphone, please, or else it doesn't get shared by everyone. Thank you.
I'm sorry if I screwed you.
Will Kaplan, I'm a senior in arts and science. Governor, are you familiar with the results of Portugal's experiment with the decriminalization of all drugs starting, I think it was in 2001?
No, but I want you to make the argument to me. No,
okay.
You're an emerging politician. Persuade this group of your position.
So Portugal decriminalized all drugs, and I think it was 2001 or 2002, and spent money on treatment for any of those that wanted it, as opposed to, say, jail time. And the results have been that drug addiction rates in Portugal have plummeted. For not just marijuana, but for harder drugs such as cocaine, heroin, amphetamines, their results have been fantastic. Time has reported on this. I think The Economist has reported on this. The Cato Institute released a report saying that the program had been wildly successful. So that would be my argument in favor of decriminalizing.
All right, well, good for you, good for you.
Anybody that needs further information on the case of Portugal, there is a report of the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., a think tank that is heavily involved on evaluating legalization, decriminalization, depenalizing. And that's what it shows in Portugal. No increase in consumption. All the money that was saved and the one they collected, even in taxes, is used to prevent, to educate, to inform, to convince kids or users that is very harmful to their health. And people respond positively to that kind of incentives. At least that's what happened in Portugal, and that's what happened in Holland. The only two experiences we have, and by the way, referendum in California was 44% in favor of marijuana legalization, and the last Gallup poll nationwide in the United States shows that 50% of people would be in agreement to legalize marijuana. It's moving pretty fast. And another statistic, 8.5% of alcohol users, either heavy or soft, die from excess in drinking. 4.5% die from excess in smoking. And only 0.04 die on excess of drug consumption. And no one single death because of marijuana.
Okay, I think we're over time. So please join me in saying thank you, muchas gracias, to our speakers, as distinguished as they are. Thank you very much.